Shoot the lights out high till it's bright out. Oh, just another lonely night. Are you willing to sacrifice your life?
Why do we believe the stories we're told? When moral absolutes are meaningless, what lessons are worth passing on to those who come after us? Few games go so far out of their way to interrogate the player's preconceptions as the Metal Gear Solid series. But even fewer games ask you to consider if your most cherished beliefs are delusions.
Only a few more steps to outer heaven.
It's hard to talk about Metal Gear Solid without at least acknowledging the series creator and longtime director, Hideo Kojima. This guy just might be the closest thing video games have to a Stanley Kubrick. Kojima is a video game auteur, someone whose ideas and artistic vision are so influential to their work that they can basically be thought of as the author. When people talk about these games, they don't talk about what the game designers are trying to say. They talk about what Kojima is trying to say. His ideas, his presence, they're what make the Metal Gear games what they are. Kojima has a singular vision for MGS, which gives him a certain level of ownership. These games are his. The Metal Gear games were some of the first to use a mainstream blockbuster format to critically examine issues like war, nationalism, identity, censorship, and the nature of reality itself. This is a AAA blockbuster game series that uses blockbuster tropes to explicitly critique lowest common denominator blockbuster entertainment. So maybe he's not gaming's Kubrick, maybe he's more of a Paul Verhoeven? Either way, very few games demand such a close reading of their themes and plot. And there are no brakes on the hype train for the fifth game in this series, The Phantom Pain. It's easy to understand why, besides the dynamic and kinetic open world gameplay that's on display here, where we get to live out our wartime fantasies as the series' central iconic character, Big Boss. But even though the Metal Gear saga has been around for more than 25 years, there's still this great, lingering, unanswered question. How did Big Boss fall from grace? Why did a war hero become the brutal leader of a rogue nuclear state and the commander of an army of child soldiers? Why did this legend become a monster? We might not know exactly how it all went down, otherwise there'd be no Phantom Pain, but the why part, that was kinda already answered for us in Metal Gear Solid 3, which was also Big Boss's origin story. Seeing this grand soliloquy from the boss at the end, it's basically implied that our sense of Big Boss being a villain is just a story we were told. We don't know if it's true. And if one phrase could possibly sum up Kojima's work, it'd be, never believe what you're told. I could keep on slobbering like this, but honestly, these are just some of the smartest, most meaningful video games you will ever play. And that's why I want you to join me on this look back at some of the key themes of the Metal Gear Solid series as we look forward to 1984. The 2015 E3 trailer for The Phantom Pain referenced one of my favorite themes from the second game in the series, Sons of Liberty. It's also one that never really gets brought up or analyzed. Good thing I'm here, right?
So the Major sought a system that used information, words, to control the subconscious.
In his eyes, the greatest symbiotic parasite the world's ever known isn't microbial. It's linguistic. Words are what keeps civilization, our world, alive.
After hearing that, I immediately thought about a scene near the end of Sons of Liberty that briefly touches on how language itself might be part of a grand, dystopian system of social control. A real tech-fueled nightmare. The whole game is basically about censorship and mind control, but this part always stuck with me.
The alphabet, 26 letters, right? It could have been 30 letters. What if the 4 deleted letters were controlled by a program?
Impossible.
It's not. In fact, something similar is already underway.
Consider that Sons of Liberty's script was originally written in Japanese. There's something here that got lost in the translation from Japanese to English. Emma's not talking about Roman alphabet letters. She's talking about Japanese hiragana characters. Hiragana is a phonetic alphabet, which means each character represents a syllable, a specific sound. The powers that be didn't censor 4 letters. They took out 5 syllables. syllables that are unpronounceable, that don't exist in Japanese.
The lale-lule-lo.
Lali-lule-lo, the code phrase of the Patriots, the game's equivalent of a world-dominating secret society like the Illuminati or the Knights Templar. They run everything, know everything, control the world, control human thought and perception itself. You see, in the Metal Gear series, many characters either can't say the word Patriots or can't hear the word Patriots. Or maybe both. It's never really 100% clear.
Nanomachine, son.
And sometimes, instead of hearing a character say Patriots, what we, the audience, hear instead is
Lale-lule-lo.
This is one of those blink-and-you-miss-it radical philosophical points that this series is so great at. It doesn't matter whether the power structures that rule the world are represented by a cloak and dagger council of 12 wise men or a digitized consciousness housed in an orbiting satellite. You see, power isn't just imposed on us from the top down. It doesn't have to be, because the systems that control us are embedded and concealed inside the language we speak. Our language and dialect reflects where we were raised. It signifies part of who we are and the values and myths that we share by speaking this language. I speak American English, which reflects the fact that I was raised in the wealthiest and most militarily powerful nation in human history. Language is not neutral. The American obsession with productivity, our reverence for our armed forces, our belief that the US is exceptional among nations. These values come second nature, and they're part of the assumed order of things. You don't have to think about them, they're just the way things are. Language reflects ideology. Language reflects power.
My thoughts, personality, how I saw right and wrong. Words can kill.
If you're like me and you waste a lot of time on YouTube, this probably sounds like one of Slovenian philosopher Slavoz Zizek's many public breakdowns. He's pretty cool for a raving maniac. You ought to go check him out, read some of his essays, or at least cop a bootleg.
Ideology is not simply imposed on ourselves. Ideology is our spontaneous relationship to our social world, how we perceive its meaning, and so on and so on.
I was in my mid-teens in late 2001 when Sons of Liberty came out. A few months had passed since the US had witnessed a scene of devastation visited on New York City. I coped by escaping into video games, specifically Sons of Liberty. And then I got to play through a story that forced me to confront my love of escapism, how it eats away at my identity and makes me easy to manipulate. My feelings were my own, but I think they're part of why so many people love and cherish these games. They can lead to moments of deep, powerful introspection, if you let them. Sons of Liberty and the Metal Gear saga in general was part of what gave me the concepts and the language that shaped the person I am, even 14 years later. I know what you're thinking.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it!
Stick with me, I'm trying to make a big point here. You know, like how the Metal Gear games have all these different individual themes that combine into a bigger picture. That's how essays work, even video essays. And I gotta do something with this journalism degree. Formal, modern language is only the most current way that information is shared and passed on. Before the written language, information was passed on through stories, through the oral tradition. And the two most modern forms of storytelling exist almost as twins, striving towards opposite goals: film and video games. Few game directors have embraced this contradiction as wholeheartedly as Kojima has. The man is a film fanatic and a connoisseur of 80s thrillers and B-action flicks in particular. He's just as comfortable referencing Dr. Strangelove as he is referencing Running Man. And there's a lot of snark about how Kojima couldn't make it as a filmmaker, so he makes movies out of video games instead. When I hear this line of argument, which is almost always said as snide criticism, my first thought is, so? There's no reason that the visual language of cinema shouldn't be made interactive. That's one of the many great potentials of video games as an artistic medium. Films tell us stories, and Kojima uses his games to show us how these stories can also represent certain values and assumptions. The Metal Gear saga has always wrestled with how ideas and values are spread through stories. Because stories that stand the test of time, stories that become crucial to the identity of a group or a nation, These are the stories that go on to become legends. And in the same way that language shapes and is shaped by power and ideology, so too are legends.
You're a legend in the eyes of those who live on the battlefield.
If the universe of Metal Gear Solid has a prime mover, a central figure around which its plot, theming, and mythology are based, it's Big Boss. In Metal Gear Solid 1, main antagonist Liquid Snake needs the corpse of the legendary soldier Big Boss because Liquid's army of super soldiers were genetically enhanced using Big Boss's DNA. And we find out Liquid and Solid Snake are twin clones of Big Boss, literal extensions of his physical self and legacy. In 2, main antagonist Solidus Snake, also a clone, is obsessed with claiming the legend of Big Boss as his own by succeeding where his father failed and defying the secret powers that control the world. 3 is the origin story of Big Boss, about how his legend is actually just the continuation of another legendary soldier's story. And this part is really important. I'm gonna get to it later, but just keep this in your back pocket for now, alright? And in Metal Gear Solid 4, this all becomes real explicit when the legend of Big Boss becomes a divine myth. Big Boss is elevated as a Christ icon at the center of the Patriots' plan for global domination. So it makes sense that Big Boss, the unifying legend of the Metal Gear saga, is himself just picking up where a real-life historic figure left off. That's right, shout out to Mr. B-Tongue, let's go back 10 centuries and examine a semi-obscure figure from Islamic history, Hassan Al-Sabbah, the Old Man of the Mountain. Al-Sabbah was a major figure in Shia Islam and a Renaissance man 6 centuries before the Renaissance. He was a scholar of chemistry, astronomy, philosophy, mathematics, and architecture. A real warrior poet type. He spent the first half of his life traveling as a missionary across the Middle East, spreading his teachings and gathering followers. There's even a very famous maxim attributed to Al-Sabbah, his so-called ultimate truth. All belief systems and legends are pointless distractions that enslave society. Only action can shape the world. Nothing is true. Everything is permitted. In the second half of his life, Sabbah and his followers seized a remote fortress named Alamut in northern Iran. Alamut would become the base of operations for his army without a nation, his own outer heaven. His soldiers were the Hashashin, the assassins. Yep, that's where Assassin's Creed got it from. Sabbah was the commander of this group of super skilled and disciplined warriors who served no nation or ideology but their own. Al-Sabbah was the big boss of the 11th century Middle East. And the assassins are legendary for their covert operations around the Mideast. The legend of the secret order Sabbah created, the legend of the assassins, this was brought back to Europe after the Crusades. This legend is the original archetype for what we in the West know as a secret society, like the Bavarian Illuminati, the Rosicrucian Freemasons, or
The Lale-Lule-Lo.
ゲームをやってもらって、ただ単に面白いとか、時間潰しができるとかそういうもんじゃなくて、そのゲームをやったことでその人の人生に何かしらの付加価値というかですね、何か持って帰れるようなそういうものに。
Big Boss, hero and myth. We've lived his story from game to game, each installment adding one more shade of gray to his character. How could this legend, this supposedly enlightened figure, become a figure of equally great evil? The pre-release trailers for Phantom Pain seem to indicate that PTSD is going to be a big factor here. It's in the name. But the Metal Gear series in general has always showed, time and again, how most of its major characters suffer from some form of post-combat trauma, and Big Boss is no exception. But these games aren't just about how war makes monsters of us all. The Metal Gear series has been saying this for nearly 3 decades. Over and over again, every game in this series asks you to consider, why do you believe the stories you're told? And Kojima makes this point by structuring each Metal Gear Solid game around a specific theme. Each game has its theme reflected in its protagonists, antagonists, and supporting characters. The story of each game is the story of the conflicts that emerge between characters who embody contradictory aspects of the theme. The theme of the Phantom Pain is race and revenge. And how do racial hatreds emerge? How is revenge bred? Prejudice and race hatred aren't the natural order of things. They must be taught. Through language. Through legends.
Now go! And let the legend come back to life.
Big Boss rejects this legend, his boss codename, for 2 games because he's haunted by the knowledge that his legend was built on the corpse of his mentor, the boss, who dreamed of a world without nationalism or ethnic hatred, a world without borders. He finally embraces his name at the post-ending sequence of Peace Walker, the game immediately preceding Metal Gear Solid 5. Big Boss's fall from hero to villain comes after he assumes his nom de guerre, which means attempting to surpass the legacy left behind by his boss, the mentor he killed. His name carries on her legacy and her legend. The thematic tension here is pretty clear. Kojima had one of his use a soliloquy to speak directly to the audience moments in Sons of Liberty, when Solid Snake talks about what stories are worth passing on to the next generation.
Listen, don't obsess over words so much. Find the meaning behind the words, then decide. You can find your own name. And your own future.
Decide for myself?
And whatever you choose will be you.
And when you can only repeat the ideas and stories set forth by someone else without examining them, without thinking about them, you've lost a piece of your humanity. Big Boss becomes a monster when he starts allowing myths to define him, and starts using that myth to try to reshape the world. The Metal Gear series' overarching message is that trying to force the world to change, to make it resemble how you think it ought to be, this can only lead to desolation, devastation. What a mess we made when it all went wrong. Now, this is a huge topic that I can't really do justice to in the space of this video, but it's another key point that might not be readily apparent to Western audiences. Part of the Western European tradition laid down during the Enlightenment is that we can and should change the world to meet our needs and desires. Every game in the Metal Gear Solid series, every theme, is a condemnation of this ideal, of the belief that we can even pretend to have control. This series draws on a much older and uniquely East Asian tradition, the idea that correct living means shaping your desires to meet the world, not the other way around. If desire causes suffering, then the correct path is to understand our limitations and to act accordingly. They even got entire religions based around this idea. And the gameplay of the Metal Gear Solid series so clearly reflects and reinforces this idea. All of the series' major mechanics are structured around remaining hidden, recognizing your own fragility and limitations, and doing your best to avoid being seen. These are stealth games, so the best way to succeed is to let go of the idea of being in control of the field of play. Success by the game's definition, a high rank at the end of the game, is killing no one and making sure that no one even knows you were there. But don't take my word for it. Listen to Kojima speaking through the supposedly dead Big Boss, delivering his final soliloquy at the end of Metal Gear Solid 4. People say this part of the game makes no sense, but they're so wrong.
Changing the world. It's about doing our best to leave the world the way it is. It's about respecting the will of others and believing in your own.
Metal Gear Solid is telling us a story about stories. It is using its own legend to illustrate how we can become entrapped and enslaved by legends. We, the player, have lived the mythology of Big Boss, who shaped the universe of Metal Gear Solid. Now, he must finally be laid to rest.